তানজিল আমরে আর গরম পানি দিয়েন না।
স্যার আমরা এখন লাইভে আছি, আমরা শুরু করতে পারি।
Good evening, distinguished faculties, attendees. Welcome to our NHF course. Today, we have a very important topic, especially in the COVID era, that is acute pulmonary embolism. It is a very dynamic clinical entity. Usually, the diagnosis is less in terms of clinical practice. And we have guest faculty, that is Professor Ghulam Azam from NICBD. He will talk on the examiner's perspective. And today we have two speakers. First speaker, Professor Fazilatunisa Malik, a world-class international interventional cardiologist, and we are very proud to have such a wonderful, brilliant speaker today. And another speaker, there is Dr. Kolimuddin. He is working in our hospital as assistant professor of cardiology. First of all, I like to invite our Professor Fazila Malik, madam, to speak on acute pulmonary embolism. She will talk on introduction, pathogenesis, pathophysiology, clinical features, and as well as diagnosis. Madam, please join us, and definitely it will be a very iconic lectures for the attendees as well as for all of the faculties. Madam, please.
Yes, thank you, Nesar. Thank you so much for your very kind words. I'm truly honored by what you said. So you can hear me, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You can hear. Yes. So, moderator, friends, colleagues, guest, a panel of experts, my students, thank you so much for inviting me here. And today we'll be talking about a very important topic, as Nesar has already pointed out, pulmonary embolism. So what is pulmonary embolism? We all understand that pulmonary embolism is the occlusion of a pulmonary artery or its branches by a thrombus. And it usually results from a deep vein thrombosis that has broken off and traveled to the pulmonary arterial circulation. And that is the most commonest cause of pulmonary embolism, deep vein thrombosis. However, in certain rare causes of pulmonary embolism can be air embolism, which is always iatrogenic when procedure in the cath lab is being done. It can be fat embolism following surgery, especially orthopedic surgery, amniotic fluid embolism during delivery, septic embolism, and in cancer patients, even tumor embolism. But these are rarer. The most common is deep vein thrombosis. So venous thromboembolism, clinically presenting as deep vein thrombosis of pulmonary embolism, is actually globally the third most frequent acute cardiovascular syndrome behind myocardial infarction and stroke. So it's pretty common if it's the third most acute cardiovascular syndrome. And the annual incidence rates of pulmonary embolism range from 39 to 115 per 100,000 of population. One thing we need to remember is that pulmonary embolism is age-related. So it will be occurring more commonly in the elderly patients, and indeed, it is 8 times higher in incidence in patients above 80 years of age compared to those who are in their 5th decade of life. And the worrying factor is that we as clinicians tend to miss the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. In fact, in a study of patients who had died of pulmonary embolism, it was found that 34% of these patients had died suddenly or within a few hours of the acute event, and therapy could not be initiated or take effect. In 59% of patients who died from pulmonary embolism, the diagnosis was made after death during autopsy. And only in 7% of the patients, the diagnosis was correctly made and treatment had been initiated before these patients died. So you can understand the magnitude. Only 7% were diagnosed. And this is not a study that was done in our country, it was done in the USA. So why would a patient have pulmonary embolism? Pulmonary embolism tends to occur in patients where the blood is hypercoagulable, where the blood flow is static in the blood in the venous circulation, or the vessels have been injured. And all of this, as we know as the Virchow's triad, leads to thrombosis. So obviously, there are predisposing factors for venous thromboembolism. And when we see a patient with these predisposing factors, and he comes to us with breathlessness, he or she, we should definitely think of pulmonary embolism. So what are the predisposing factors for venous thromboembolism? Very strong factors are orthopedic surgery. So a fracture of the lower limb, hip or knee replacement, any major trauma, spinal cord injury, or even in cardiac cases, myocardial infarction within the last 3 months. Moderate risk factors would be a patient who has just given delivery in the postpartum period, a patient who is on oral contraceptive pills, a patient with cancer, and a patient who is receiving chemotherapy. One thing that we need to remember, a patient who has a central venous line. So when a patient has a central venous line for prolonged time, we should definitely take proper care of that central venous line. Patients with thrombophilia or with coagulation disorders. Weak risk factors are pregnancy, obesity, diabetes, hypertension. So there are numerous predisposing factors, and we have to remember these predisposing factors so that we can think about pulmonary embolism as a differential diagnosis and treat these patients when they come to us. The pulmonary embolism, if you look at the pathophysiology, the pulmonary emboli most often, as I've already mentioned, arise from the deep veins of the lower extremity and pelvis, and very rarely they can originate in the subclavian veins or in the arm veins. And the consequences become apparent when 30 to 50% of the pulmonary arterial bed has become occluded. The lower lobes of the lungs are most frequently affected. Bilateral lung involvement is common, and large emboli can wedge in the main pulmonary artery or the main branches, which we know as the saddle embolus, and can be rapidly fatal. Smaller emboli can go and occlude the periphery of the pulmonary artery and its branches. So what happens if a large embolus is occluding the pulmonary artery? The right ventricle cannot pump blood. So the right ventricle, due to the sudden acute pressure overload, the right ventricle tends to fail. And this is the main cause of death in severe pulmonary embolism. Also, due to the obstruction in pulmonary embolism, due to the vasoconstriction, there is release of numerous mediators of vasoconstriction further, like thromboxane A2 and serotonin, and these also contribute to the initial increase in pulmonary vascular resistance. So when there is a sudden acute increase in pulmonary vascular resistance, what happens? The right ventricle tends to fail. Not only does it tend to fail, it also acutely dilates. And when the ventricle dilates, its contraction time obviously becomes prolonged, if you remember the Frank-Starling's law. So the right ventricle is not contracting properly, and its contraction has also become prolonged. So prolongation of the right ventricular contraction time goes into the early diastole of the left ventricle, and it leads to the bowing of the interventricular septum towards the left ventricle. And this dysynchrony between the right and the left ventricle may be further exacerbated if there is development of acute right bundle branch block. So when the filling time of the left ventricle decreases, there is obviously reduced left ventricular filling in early diastole. So there is a reduction in the cardiac output, and all of this can lead to shock. So basically there is a spiraling of effects which happens with a large pulmonary embolism, with starting with the RV dilatation, increased RV wall tension, increased RV oxygen demand, reduced RV contractility, reduced left ventricular period, reduced cardiac output, and all of this can spiral and lead to shock and eventually even to death in a patient who has a very large pulmonary embolism. So how will this patient present to us? Obviously, the severity of pulmonary embolism is related to the size of the embolus. So according to this size of the embolus and the severity of the pulmonary embolism can be divided into a massive pulmonary embolism, such a large embolus that it is causing hemodynamic compromise. It can be submassive pulmonary embolism, where we see right ventricular dysfunction, either by echo or by CT, or it can be a non-massive or low-risk pulmonary embolism where there's no evidence of RV dysfunction and no evidence of any hemodynamic compromise. So we divide pulmonary embolism into massive, submassive, and non-massive. And obviously, the mortality of the patients varies with the severity of the pulmonary embolism. In fact, with a massive pulmonary embolism, the 90-day mortality rate is almost 60%. With a submassive pulmonary embolism, it is around 15%. And in a patient with low-risk pulmonary embolism, it is less than 2%. So how will these patients present to us? Obviously, the clinical presentation will also depend upon the size of the embolus. A small embolus may present with non-specific features like episodes of breathlessness or tiredness. And sometimes we need to remember, like say a young female is on oral contraceptive pills, and she comes and tells us that she has these repeated episodes of dyspnea, and we cannot find anything. And in many instances, we tend to diagnose this as anxiety neurosis or something like that. But we should always take the history. Maybe the fact that she's on oral contraceptive pills, maybe she's having small embolus which are repeatedly causing these episodes of breathlessness. Now, medium-sized embolus may cause a segment of the pulmonary tree to get obstructed, and eventually this can lead to pulmonary infarction. So a patient who has had a pulmonary infarction due to a medium-sized embolus in the pulmonary artery will come to us with symptoms of chest pain, low-grade fever, episodes of dyspnea, and hemoptysis. And here also we might confuse this with something else, maybe an infective cause or something. A massive pulmonary embolism occurs when there is occlusion of around 2/3 or more of the pulmonary arterial bed. And these patients will come to us with severe dyspnea, severe chest pain, and these patients may even come to us in a collapsed state. So the symptoms will vary according to the size of the embolus. So if we look a bit deeply into dyspnea, which is the most commonly presenting feature of pulmonary embolism, it may be acute and severe when there is a central pulmonary embolism. The patient is really, really breathless, and the breathlessness has occurred very suddenly. It may be mild and transient, as I said, in small peripheral pulmonary embolism. Maybe the patient is having recurrent episodes of small peripheral pulmonary embolism. And one very important fact that we should remember is that maybe there's a patient who has already had diagnosed case of congestive heart failure, and this patient comes to us with worsening dyspnea. So maybe this patient is immobile, doesn't walk that much, and has developed a deep vein thrombosis. And from that, he or she is having pulmonary embolism, which is causing a sudden worsening of dyspnea. So in a patient with a known cause of heart failure or known cause of pulmonary artery disease, if that patient suddenly develops worsening dyspnea, we should keep pulmonary embolism in mind. So dyspnea is one of the major presenting features in a patient. Chest pain is also a very common feature, and the chest pain in pulmonary embolism is usually caused by pleural irritation in the distal part of the lungs when it's causing pulmonary infarction. In case of central pulmonary embolism, the chest pain may be a typical angina-like character, and the differential diagnosis here would be acute coronary syndrome or aortic dissection. And this occurs due to acute right ventricular ischemia. One important thing is that pulmonary embolism is actually quite an important differential diagnosis in patients who come to us with syncope. In fact, in patients presented with syncope, in 17% of these patients, the underlying cause is a pulmonary embolism. So it may occur in a patient with pulmonary embolism who has hemodynamic insufficiency and has RV dysfunction. Hemoptysis may result when a patient comes with pulmonary infarction in a medium-sized vessel. And the vessel subsequently, there has been infarction, as I said. So common, these features like dyspnea, chest pain, hemoptysis, these happen in such a wide variety of pulmonary as well as cardiac causes that we often do not think about pulmonary embolism. But when a patient like this comes to us, obviously, we look for signs. Now, the signs also vary with the size of the embolus. So small and even medium-sized emboli may be devoid of any abnormal clinical signs. However, in case of when there's a pulmonary infarction, we might get a pleural rub. A large emboli will obviously cause hypotension, shock, tachycardia. There might be cyanosis, raised JVP, increased intensity of the P2, and the RV third and fourth heart sounds may also be audible. And we should suspect a massive pulmonary embolism in any patient who has predisposing factors, like maybe a patient has had orthopedic surgery, hip replacement, and 2 days down the road, the patient suddenly develops features of shock, syncope, dyspnea, or sudden chest pain. Or a predisposing factor like had a major trauma, 2 days down the road, develops this. So there should be a presence of predisposing factor plus sudden development of shock, syncope, dyspnea, etc. We should think that this could be a case of pulmonary embolism. So when a patient comes to us with chest pain and dyspnea, what do? We first of all, we do an ECG, of course. So the first test that we would do is a ECG. But unfortunately, in pulmonary embolism, most of the cases, it will not be that informative. In mild cases of pulmonary embolism, we just have sinus tachycardia present in 40% of our patients. During acute pulmonary embolism, the patient might have atrial arrhythmias, or the patient in certain cases might present with atrial fibrillation. And only in severe cases where the prognosis is going to be quite bad do we see the classical ECG findings of S1, Q3, T3, or T-wave inversions in V1, V4, or incomplete or complete right bundle branch block. So this is just to recap the ECG findings that we find in very severe pulmonary embolism, S1, Q3, T3, as I said, T-wave inversions from V1 to V4, and in this patient, complete right bundle branch block. Now, an X-ray test, this is also something that we will routinely do in a patient who comes to us with chest pain and breathlessness. The X-ray in the vast majority of patients with pulmonary embolism will be absolutely normal, but it will be useful for us to exclude other causes of acute dyspnea or acute chest pain. Like if we do an X-ray and we can see pneumothorax, then this patient is obviously a patient of pneumothorax, or other causes like pneumonia. So X-ray will be useful for excluding other causes of dyspnea and chest pain. But if a patient with pulmonary infarction or with pulmonary embolism, certain X-ray findings may also be present. Now, what are those? So if there's a large pulmonary embolism, what will it do? It will go and obstruct the main pulmonary artery branch. And this gives rise to an enlarged pulmonary artery. Now, distal to the obstructed pulmonary artery, there will be no blood flow. And that will lead to oligemia of that lung field. If a area gets infarcted, obviously, it will lead to elevation of the hemidiaphragm. There might be wedge-shaped opacity if infarction develops. And in certain cases, there might be pleural effusion, which occurs after pleurisy. So these X-ray findings we may find. And interestingly, these X-ray findings have some interesting names according to the scientists or physicians who discovered these. So when there's a decreased vascularity in the periphery of the lungs, we call this Westermarck sign. When there is enlargement of the central pulmonary artery, it is known as Freshnel sign. Enlarged right descending pulmonary artery is called Pallas sign, and the pleural-based area of increased opacity is known as the Hampton hump. And the Hampton hump might be given to us as an X-ray in OSPE, and obviously we would need to have the differentials ready. So the Hampton's hump is the wedge-shaped opacity that we see when there is pulmonary infarction. We would need to learn the differentials of this as well. Decreased vascularity of the lung distal to the obstructed pulmonary artery, the Westermarck sign, pallor sign, enlarged right descending pulmonary artery, a Fleischner sign, the prominent dilated central pulmonary arteries. So all these X-ray signs may be present. And in a patient with breathlessness, we often do an arterial blood gas. And what will we find in the arterial blood gas? We'll find that there's a reduced PO2, a reduced PCO2, and in very severe massive pulmonary embolism, there might be metabolic acidosis. So we have a patient who has predisposing factors of pulmonary embolism. He or she is breathless, has chest pain, and only then, if we have the index of suspicion, we will arrange for tests that will lead us to the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. Because the tests that establish the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism are not usually routinely done. So how will we decide on whom to send for these tests? Well, we can do that pre-assessment either by our clinical judgment. So our clinical judgment says that this patient needs the tests to be done, which will establish this patient as a pulmonary embolism, or we have certain prediction rules, which will give us an idea, well, this patient needs these tests. So what are the prediction rules? Well, one of them is the Wells clinical prediction rule for diagnosing pulmonary embolism, and the other is the Geneva clinical prediction rule. And if we just go very briefly through the Wells clinical prediction rule, so initially it was very complex with the numerous numbers. Now they have simplified it. So what are the, first of all, if we have a patient who has already previously had history of documented diagnosed pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis, then we should definitely think there is a chance. If the patient's heart rate is more than 100 per minute, a patient who has recently had a surgery in the last 4 weeks, a patient who comes to us with hemoptysis, a patient with active cancer, a patient has clinical signs of deep vein thrombosis. So her leg is red, swollen, tender, painful, the calf muscles are swollen. Then we think, okay, this is a case possibly of deep vein thrombosis, could be that there has been an episode of pulmonary embolism. So for each of this, in the simplified Wells clinical prediction rule, we give 1 point, and any patient who has more than 2 points warrants that we should do the tests which will establish the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. The revised Geneva clinical prediction rule for pulmonary embolism also has certain points like that. I won't go into the details, you can look it up. So one thing we need to remember is the tests that need to be done to establish the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism are expensive. So we cannot subject every patient who comes to us with dyspnea or chest pain to these tests, because they will lead to unnecessary cost as well as complication. So we will do the prediction tests, we will assess, and then we will send the patient. And in certain patients, our clinical judgment will tell us that these patients do not require further tests for pulmonary embolism. So who are those patients who have a very low likelihood of having pulmonary embolism? As I had already said, that pulmonary embolism is age related. So any patient whose age is below 50 years and who does not have any predisposing factors, any patient whose heart rate is less than 100, whose oxygen saturation is above 94, there is no unilateral leg swelling, no hemoptysis, no recent history of trauma or surgery, no history of venous thromboembolism, not on oral contraceptives. So these patients, we do not need to do workup for pulmonary embolism. But for those who our clinical judgment tells us, or the prediction rules have established, might have a pulmonary embolism, obviously we will send them for these specific tests that need to be done. Now, the most common test that we will first of all do is the D-dimer test. And the plasma D-dimer test is a useful screening test. It is a sensitive test, but it is not specific for pulmonary embolism because it may be elevated in myocardial infarction, in sepsis, in cancer, and in second and third trimester of pregnancy. And in fact, if we have decided to do the D-dimer test for a patient who is in the ICU and we suspect is having a pulmonary embolism, almost all the patients will have elevated D-dimer. But the interesting fact is, so the elevated D-dimer will not confirm the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism, but a negative D-dimer virtually excludes pulmonary embolism, and you do not need to do any further tests. So a D-dimer is a very useful screening test that we do initially to exclude or to do further tests for pulmonary embolism. And for elderly patients, age-adjusted cutoff values of D-dimer should be used. Now, the next most commonly written test is the computed CT scan pulmonary angiographic. And the CTPA is a standalone imaging test to exclude pulmonary embolism. And it is indeed the method of choice for imaging the pulmonary vasculature in patients whom we suspect of pulmonary embolism, because it allows adequate visualization of the pulmonary arteries down to the subsegmental levels. So we can get great pictures, especially if it's a saddle embolus, or we can get eccentric partial filling defects. And they have very interesting names for this, like this is the polo mint sign, and this is the railway track sign. So a different views of the same thing. Now, the next test after CT angio that we might need to consider is the VQ scan and ventilation perfusion scan. And in acute pulmonary embolism, we expect that the ventilation is normal, but there is perfusion is not there, and there is a mismatch between these. And this is the preferred test in pregnant women. So what do? We give the patient inhale some gas, and this gas usually is like technetium-99 labeled gas. And we give the patient radioactive dye, which is usually albumin, radioactive aggregated albumin, which you give in the vein. And then this passes to the lungs. And in the lungs, the ventilation is normal, but the perfusion is not there. So there is a mismatch between the inhaled and injected compound on the lung scan image. So the ventilation is normal, but the perfusion is not normal. So there is a mismatch between ventilation and perfusion. Now, the third test that we would do if we suspect pulmonary angiography is pulmonary angiography. But nowadays, pulmonary angiography is not that commonly done. Initially in the past, this was the gold standard test for diagnosing pulmonary angiography. But nowadays, we don't do it because we've got the CT, which is a lot easier to do. And pulmonary angiography, let's face it, it's uncomfortable. And in many instances, there are potential risks involved while we are doing the procedure. But obviously, as I said, it will definitely show the emboli, and it is the gold standard for diagnosing. What about MRI? Well, gadolinium enhanced MRI is not as sensitive as CT for diagnosing pulmonary embolism, but it can be done in patients with poor renal function where we think that CT would be too hazardous. So if we compare the different tests that are available, the CTPA is, why is it good? Because it's readily available. We can get it in any part of the world. It has great, excellent accuracy. However, the problem with this is that there is radiation exposure and also exposure to iodine contrast. So we cannot give it to patients who are hypersensitive to iodine, or who have hyperthyroidism, or patients who are pregnant or breastfeeding female patients, or patients at end stage chronic kidney disease. So those are the downsides of CTPA. What about VQ scan? Well, VQ scan is a relatively inexpensive procedure. Radiation is required, but very, very low dose of radiation. So it can be used very easily, but it's not that readily available in all parts of the world or in all centers. And pulmonary angiography, historically the gold standard, but lots of side effects, not readily available, and not a very comfortable procedure to do. What about echo? So we can do echo also, and echo, what will we find? So first of all, we might get an enlarged right ventricle, and this will be present only in 40% of the patients, only in case of a large emboli. In small emboli, we will not find any findings in the echo. So in a large emboli, there might be acute enlargement of the right ventricle, and we might see this in the echo. And the ratio between right ventricle and left ventricle will be more than 1. And this enlarged right ventricle will also be hypokinetic, but also in RV infarction, we get hypokinesia. But interestingly, in pulmonary embolism, the apex will be spared. So a global hypokinesia of the RV sparing the apex, and this is known as the McConnell sign. Due to enlargement of the RV, it will cause a flattening of the interventricular septum, and this can be seen in parasternal short axis view. The inferior vena cava may be dilated, and there will be not much variation with respiration in its size. We can get the 60 by 60 side, which is acceleration time of the pulmonary ejection is less than 60 milliseconds. And also there is a mildly elevated peak systolic gradient of the tricuspid valve, which is less than 60 millimeters. We can also get a decreased tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion less than 16 millimeters. But obviously the most gold standard would be if we find a free floating thrombus in the right ventricle, but this will be present only in 4% of the patients. What next? If we have obvious signs of deep vein thrombosis, then we can do compression ultrasonography. Even if we do not have that, if we suspect that there could be deep vein thrombosis, we should do compression ultrasonography. And this is the primary diagnostic criteria for deep vein thrombosis is the loss of the vein compression. We need to remember that normally the calf veins will collapse completely when gentle pressure is applied over the skin. And in 30 to 50% of patients, a compression ultrasonography will reveal the presence of deep vein thrombosis. So compression, these veins will be enlarged and they will be non-compressible. What about contrast venography? Well, contrast venography was also once a very great test that was commonly employed, but nowadays we hardly ever do venograms to establish diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis. We can also do certain laboratory biomarkers which will tell us that there has been acute myocardial injury, like we can do plasma troponin, which will be elevated. Then we can do BNP, NT-proBNP, which get elevated because of RV pressure overload during acute pulmonary embolism. Other laboratory tests like lactate, this is a marker for imbalance between tissue oxygen supply and demand, and elevated plasma levels of more than 2 millimoles predict adverse prognosis. The elevated serum creatinine and hyponatremia, these are also associated with increased in-hospital mortality. So we need to do certain tests to establish our diagnosis as well as to assess the severity of the pulmonary embolism. And indeed, there is a pulmonary embolism severity index. And this also nowadays has there is a simplified pulmonary embolism severity index with 1 point for each. And what are those points? One is age. So the more elderly your patient, the more we need to worry about that patient. A patient who has cancer, a patient who is in heart failure, a patient who has chronic pulmonary disease, a patient whose heart rate is more than 110, a patient whose systolic blood pressure is less than 100, respiratory rate is more than 30, temperature is less than 36, patient is has arterial oxygen saturation of less than 90%. So for all points, we give 1 point each. and we can divide these patients according to their severity index into different classes. And these classes also tell us about the 30-day mortality. In fact, when the patient is in class 5, the mortality is around 10 to 25%. So the 30-day mortality goes very high. And as I was saying, so we can predict the in-hospital or 30-day mortality very easy by assessing the pulmonary embolism severity index. So this is all about the clinical presentation and pathophysiology and the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. But before I end, I would just like to share with you that a case report that we did like 3-4 years ago about a female patient. And this patient had a very interesting history, and we published it also in our journal. So this 53-year-old female, what she did is she was having recurrent bouts of breathlessness. So she would become breathless along with chest pain, and she was having this for the last few months. And initially, actually, she came to us with the severe chest pain and breathlessness. Her troponins were significantly elevated, and an angiogram was done because we suspected that she was a case of non-STEMI, and the angiogram was absolutely normal. A few weeks down the road, she again came with chest pain and breathlessness. During the first hospitalization, her echo was absolutely normal. The second time down the road, she had enlargement of the right ventricle. And we started asking her history, and we found that she had had an operation in her calf muscle and in her leg a few months back. And then we did a compression ultrasound of the legs. We found there was thrombus. And the next day we did again a repeat echo of hers, and we found the free floating thrombus in the right ventricle. And as I said, the free floating thrombus is very, very rare, only in 4% of cases. So we treated this patient, and I'm sure Colin will go into the details. And as he was just spewing thrombus repeatedly and embolizing them into the pulmonary circulation, we also put in a filter, inferior vena cava filter. And this was the report that we did after 1 year. And this has been like 4 years now, and she's doing absolutely fine. So without further ado, I would like to say thank you from our entire team. And I'm in the cath lab, and they all helped me to set up the computer and all, because I'm not very good with computers. So thank you for giving me this opportunity of presenting pulmonary embolism. Thank you.
Thank you, Fazila ma'am, for your very enlightening talk on pulmonary embolism. Definitely, it's an iconic lecture, which I have already told you.
You're too kind. Thank you.
Now we go to our second speaker, because we have a bit short of time. Dr. Colin is a very dynamic and hyperkinetic as well. He's a very person in our department, and we will talk on management of acute pulmonary embolism. Dr. Colin, please share your slide.
Thank you, sir, for your kind introduction. Respected moderators, panelists, and expert panel and faculties, and all learned audience, Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Mohammad Kolimuddin from National Heart Foundation Hospital Research Institute, presenting acute pulmonary embolism management. As Madam said, that pulmonary embolism manifests with a wide spectrum of acuity ranging from mild to severe. Therefore, rapid and accurate risk stratification assumes paramount importance. And the three key components for this stratification are clinical evaluation: is patient is stable or unstable? If patient unstable, then we should give thrombolytic therapy, reperfusion treatment, and then assessment of right ventricular size and function, if there is right ventricular dysfunction present or not, and then analysis of cardiac biomarkers to determine whether there is right ventricular microinfarction present or not. And the pulmonary embolism severity index identifies 11 features from demographics, history, and clinical findings that can be weighted and scored to identify low risk and high risk patients. Madam discuss is detailed. There are another severity risk for HTCR criteria, and there's a risk adjusted management strategy for acute pulmonary embolism. If we suspect patient with acute pulmonary embolism, we should anticoagulate and then assess hemodynamic stability. If patient has hemodynamically unstable, then it is high risk patient and he should get reperfusion treatment and hemodynamic support. If patient hemodynamically stable, and then we distinguish low from intermediate risk pulmonary embolism, and we check for clinical signs of pulmonary embolism severity or serious comorbidity. It is pulmonary embolism severity index if class 3 to 4, that is points more than 86, or simplified pulmonary embolism severity score more than 1. Alternatively, 1 Hestia criteria if present. And another second option is right ventricular dysfunction on transthoracic echocardiography or computed tomographic pulmonary angiography. And if clinical signs of pulmonary embolism severity present or right ventricular dysfunction present, then we should perform troponin test. If troponin test is positive and RV dysfunction present, this patient regarded as intermediate high risk patient. And this patient should receive first few hours to days should be monitored and receive unfractionated IV heparin. And if monitored, if there is a clinical deterioration, if hemodynamically patient unstable, then we should resume rescue thrombolytic therapy or reperfusion therapy. If troponin level is negative, then it is intermediate low risk patient, and this patient should be hospitalized and receive oral anticoagulant. And if there is no RV dysfunction and clinical signs of pulmonary embolism severity or serious comorbidity, then it is low risk and we should treat it by oral anticoagulants. And now TINPET option in high risk pulmonary embolism patient is a 4-component hemodynamic and respiratory support, which includes oxygen therapy and ventilation, pharmacological treatment of acute right ventricular failure, mechanical circulatory support and oxygenation, advanced life support in cardiac arrest. And initial anticoagulation, it is parental anticoagulation followed by non-vitamin K antagonist oral anticoagulant, that is NOAC or vitamin K antagonist. And reperfusion treatment options are systemic thrombolysis, percutaneous catheter directed treatment, or surgical embolectomy, and vena cava filters. Then if hemodynamic and respiratory support, oxygen therapy and ventilation, if oxygen saturation less than 90%, then we should give oxygen, and high flow oxygen mechanical ventilatory support in case of extreme instability or that is cardiac arrest. And pharmacological treatment of right ventricular failure in high risk pulmonary embolism patient, we should optimize volume. If patient is normal or low central venous pressure, then we can give volume load, saline or Ringer's lactate less than 500 ml over 15 to 30 minutes. And vasopressor and inotrophs if there is hemodynamic patient if hemodynamically unstable. Norepinephrine 0.2 to 1 microgram per kg per minute, or dobutamine 2 to 2 microgram per kg per minute. It all improves RV inotropy, and norepinephrine particularly restores coronary perfusion gradient, and ECMO if mechanical circulatory support needed. And advanced life support in cardiac arrest, once a thrombolytic drug is administered, cardiopulmonary resuscitation should be continued for at least 60 to 90 minutes before terminating resuscitation attempts. As we usually continue CPR up to 30 to 40 minutes, but if in case of pulmonary embolism suspected cases, we should continue for 60 to 90 minutes. And initial anticoagulation, parental anticoagulation should be initiated if while awaiting the result of diagnostic test in case of severe high risk pulmonary embolism patient, and this should be done with subcutaneous low weight adjusted low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinux or IV unfractionated heparin. Based on pharmacokinetic data on equally rapid anticoagulant effect can also be achieved with NOAC. Low molecular weight heparin and fondaparinux are preferred over unfractionated heparin for the initial anticoagulation, as they carry lower risk of inducing major bleeding and heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. It is usually started with 8 unit per kg, followed by an infusion of 18 unit per kg per hour. It is nowadays unfractionated heparin is restricted to patient with overt hemodynamic instability or imminent hemodynamic decompression, in whom primary reperfusion treatment will be necessary. That is, it is high risk and intermediate high risk patient. Unfractionated heparin is also recommended in patient with severe renal impairment, creatinine class less than 30 ml per minute. The advantage over unfractionated heparin of low molecular weight heparin is their greater bioavailability and can be administered subcutaneously, longer duration of anticoagulant effect, fixed dose drugs, and no laboratory monitoring, and safely administered in outpatient setting. NOAC are small molecules and that directly inhibit one activated coagulation factor, which is thrombin for dabigatran, and factor 10A for apixaban, edoxaban, and rivaroxaban. They are can be given fixed dose without routine laboratory monitoring, and they have fewer drug interaction. There's comparison between among non-NOAC, dabigatran, apixaban, edoxaban, and rivaroxaban. Their peak time to effect, time to peak effect is almost around 1 to 2 hours. And dose is dabigatran 150 milligram 12 hourly, and rivaroxaban 150 milligram 12 hourly for 3 days, weeks, and then 20 milligram once daily. And edoxaban 60 milligram once daily, and apixaban 100 milligram 12 hourly for 7 days, and then 5 milligram once daily. All are approved by FDA. And vitamin K antagonist prevents gamma carboxylation activation of coagulant factor 2, 7, 9, and 10. It usually started with 5 milligram daily, and debilitated patient and elderly patient required half dose. And anticoagulation effect becomes evident after 5 to 7 days. And we should adjust daily dose according to INR over the next 5 to 7 days, aiming INR level 2 to 3. When vitamin K antagonists are used, anticoagulation with unfractionated heparin, low molecular heparin, or fondaparinux should be continued in parallel with the oral anticoagulation for 5 or more than 5 days, because this monotherapy with vitamin K antagonist decreases the level of two endogenous anticoagulant, protein C and protein S, thus increasing thrombogenic potential. So they should be overlapped with other heparin. Systemic thrombolysis. Regarding reperfusion treatment, thrombolytic therapy leads to faster improvement in pulmonary obstruction, pulmonary artery pressure, and pulmonary vascular resistance. Greater benefits observed within 48 hours of symptom onset, but it can be useful up to 6 to 14 days. Unsuccessful thrombolysis is judged by persistent clinical instability and unchanged RV dysfunction on echocardiography after 36 hours. And its frequency is 80% in high-risk pulmonary embolism patient. Dissolution of thrombus in the pelvic or deep vein leg veins theoretically decrease the likelihood of recurrent pulmonary embolism. Thrombolysis may also improve pulmonary capillary blood flow and reduce the likelihood of developing chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. Among tissue plasminogen activator, only alteplase is recommended for management of pulmonary embolism, and dose is 100 milligram over 2 hours. And accelerated regime is 0.6 milligram per kg over 15 minutes, maximum dose of 50 milligram in case of cardiac arrest. And streptokinase, 2.5 lakh unit loading dose over 30 minutes, followed by 1 lakh unit per hour over 12 to 14 hours. And the accelerated regime is 1.5 million over 2 hours. And urokinase dose is 4,400 international unit per kg as a loading dose over 10 minutes, and same dose per hour over 12 to 24 hours. And accelerated regimen is when used 3 million over 2 hours. Percutaneous catheter directed treatment is a mechanical reperfusion is based on the insertion of a catheter into the pulmonary arteries via the femoral root. Different types of catheter are used for mechanical fragmentation, thrombus aspiration, or more commonly a pharmacomechanical approach, combining mechanical or ultrasound fragmentation of the thrombus with in situ reduced dose thrombolysis. There's catheter-directed thrombolysis with intervention with thrombolysis or without thrombolysis. Surgical embolectomy. Surgical embolectomy in case of acute pulmonary embolism is usually carried out with cardiopulmonary bypass without aortic cross incision of two pulmonary arteries with the removal or suction of fresh clots. Recent reports have indicate favorable surgical result in high-risk pulmonary embolism with or without cardiac arrest, and in selected cases of intermediate risk pulmonary embolism. vena cava filters. The aim of vena cava interruption is to mechanically prevent venous clots from reaching the pulmonary circulation. Most devices in current use are inserted percutaneously and can be retrieved after several weeks or months, or left in place over the long term if needed. And indications are if absolute contraindication to anticoagulation treatment and recurrent pulmonary embolism despite adequate anticoagulation, and primary prophylaxis in patient with high risk venous thromboembolism. In case of emergency department management, if a suspected high risk pulmonary embolism, administer heparin, ECG to exclude acute coronary syndrome, or to look for RV strain, and then echocardiography to exclude alternate cardiac cause or confirm right ventricular dysfunction, and oxygen therapy, volume challenge, inotropics and or vasodilators, and intubation and mechanical ventilation if unstable. If after initial stabilization, computed tomography, pulmonary angiography if confirmed pulmonary embolism, then reperfusion therapy. If no contraindication, then thrombolysis. If there is contraindication, then surgical or catheter embolectomy. This is ESC 2019 guideline in unfractionated heparin without delay in patient with high risk pulmonary embolism, which is class 1 indication. Thrombolytic therapy, class 1 indication. Surgical pulmonary embolectomy, it is also class 1 indication. And percutaneous catheter directed treatment, it is class 2A indication, it should be considered. And norepinephrine, dobutamine, 2A indication, and may be considered ECMO in case of refractory circulatory collapse. And vena cava infilter is a class 2A indication. And for intermediate or low risk pulmonary embolism, without delay, we should, in high risk and intermediate risk clinical probability, while diagnostic workup is in progress, we should initiate anticoagulation. In low risk patient, we should, after diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. And in case of anticoagulation, low molecular weight is preferred over unfractionated heparin, it is class 1 indication. And NOAC is recommended in preference to vitamin K antagonist, it is also class 1 recommendation. And when patient treated with vitamin K overlapping with parenteral anticoagulation is also class 1 recommendation. And NOAC is not recommended in severe renal impairment during pregnancy and lactation and patient with antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And rescue thrombolytic therapy is recommended for patient with hemodynamic deterioration on anticoagulation treatment, it is class 1 indication. And surgical embolectomy, percutaneous catheter directed treatment in case of intermediate or low risk pulmonary embolism, it is 2A indication. And pulmonary embolism in pregnancy. Then, if suspected pulmonary embolism during pregnancy is high risk probability and intermediate risk probability and positive D-dimer, we should anticoagulate with a patient with low molecular weight heparin. We should do a chest X-ray and compression proximal duplex ultrasound. If DVT present, then we should continue with low molecular heparin in a therapeutic dose. And 36 weeks before delivery, we should change to unfractionated heparin. And if there is no proximal DVT, then we should, if there is X-ray normal, then computed tomography, pulmonary angiography, or perfusion lung scan. If X-ray abnormal, then only computed tomography, pulmonary angiography. If test is negative, then pulmonary embolism rule out. If not intermediate or positive, review by radiologist or nuclear physician experienced in diagnosis of pulmonary embolism in pregnancy. And if positive, we should continue low molecular weight heparin and assess pulmonary angiographic severity and risk of early death, and refer to multidisciplinary team for experience of pulmonary embolism management in pregnancy. Madam already discussed about 30 days mortality risk assessment. There is high risk, intermediate, high and low risk, and low risk. And risk of recurrence of pulmonary embolism. The estimated long-term risk recurrence is low, 3 groups: low, intermediate, and high. Low group is if there is major transient or reversible factor, they have more than 10-fold increased risk for index ventricular venous thromboembolism. And examples are surgery with general anesthesia for more than 30 minutes, confined to bed in hospital more than 30 days for acute illness or acute exacerbation of chronic illness, and trauma with fracture. And there is transient and reversible factor. There's minor surgery, less than 30 minutes anesthesia, admission to hospital for less than 3 days with acute illness, estrogen therapy, pregnancy, confined to bed out of hospital for more than 3 days with acute illness, leg injury, and long haul flight, it is also intermediate risk. There is risk of 3 to 8% per year. And non-malignant persistent risk factors are inflammatory bowel disease, active autoimmune disease, and high risk patients are active cancer, one or more previous venous thromboembolism, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. In current guideline, terminology such as provoked and unprovoked venous thromboembolism or pulmonary embolism is no longer supported, as it is potentially misleading and not helpful for decision making regarding duration of anticoagulation therapy. And if duration of anticoagulation therapy, all patients should receive 3 months of oral anticoagulation. And if patient first pulmonary embolism and secondary to major transient reversible factor, anticoagulation should be recommended only for 3 months. And after 3 months, it is class 1 indication if there is recurrent VT and recurrent venous thromboembolism not related to major transient or reversible risk factor, and oral anticoagulant with vitamin K antagonist indefinite period for antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And after 3 months for indefinite period, it is class 2 indication if not identifiable risk factor with first episode of pulmonary embolism, and 2A indication if patient with persistent risk factor other than antiphospholipid antibody syndrome like autoimmune disease and inflammatory bowel disease. This is indefinite period. And indefinite period first episode if there is minor transient or reversible risk factor. It is all class 2A indication. It should be considered. And if oral anticoagulation should be if NOAC goes in extended anticoagulation. If we extend non-vitamin K antagonist anticoagulant, then we should reduce apixaban 2.5 milligram and rivaroxaban 10 milligram once daily instead of 20 milligram once daily. And the adverse prognostic factor in pulmonary embolism, there is ECG criteria and biomarkers elevated troponin and nitric peptide, computed tomography, RV diameter, LV diameter ratio more than 0.9, ventricular septal bowing from right to left, and presence of RV enlargement. Echocardiography findings are RV dilatation and hypokinesis, RV diameter and LV diameter ratio more than 0.9, interventricular septal flattening and paradoxical leftward septal motion, presence of tricuspid regurgitation, presence of hypertension, and RV fuel hypokinesis with apical sparing McConnell signs. Thank you for patient hearing.
So Nessa sir, are you there? So I would like to, on behalf of Nessa sir, I would like to request Professor Ghulam Azam to give his opinion as expert panelist regarding the lecture and what the students should know and everything. Professor, please.
Thank you. Is it Tawfiq?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I said. Thank you, Tawfiq. And I really enjoyed a lot, especially our renowned Professor Fazilatunnisa Malik Madam. He gave his details regarding acute pulmonary thromboembolism.
Thank you.
And Olivuddin also covered the management part. I think it is well covered. But one thing for our fellows or students in the exam, it is already discussed in the exam table, especially in the long viva, and some extent in the case of ECG or other test findings related discussion. I just want to say it is mostly clinical diagnosis. It should be validated by at least 2 test approach for confirmed diagnosis and management strategy. And it is nicely presented and showed a wonderful slide, especially pre-test probability and management phase probability by PACE, pulmonary embolism severity index score, how to manage by 2 test approach. I really amazed, and I think our students learn a lot. But it is because it is a medical emergency, everybody should know how to at least clinical suspiciousness, how to develop. Severe chest pain or shock or acute breathlessness, unexplained acute breathlessness should be suspect. It is maybe acute pulmonary thromboembolism. But simultaneously, we should exclude pneumothorax and myocardial infarction and dissecting aortic aneurysm as quick as possible, so that we can do at least one ECG immediately and clinical test at least percussion to exclude the pneumothorax, and at least measure the blood pressure to limb to exclude dissecting aortic, so that we can predict, yes, it might be a case of acute pulmonary thromboembolism with our risk assessment strategy. Second thing, ECG we can go, but ECG sometimes, as you know, 20% case ECG should be normal. 10% only give specific some findings. Madam wonderfully showed S1, Q3, T3. It is 10% case. It is easily, we can, in our daily practice, we can find less than 10% cases, but it is pathognomic. It is almost diagnostic, but not always it is, we can find it in our daily practice. Similarly, in chest X-ray, normal chest X-ray with unexplained chest discomfort or like dyspnea or unexplained tachypnea, it gives the clue for acute pulmonary thromboembolism. And if, as you know, we don't have enough facilities to diagnostic strategy like CT, CTPA or pulmonary angiogram, so that we have to depend on this Bayesian test and also echo, bedside echo. If you go for bedside echo, if I find acute RV dysfunction or McConnell sign, so that we can conclude at least it is a pulmonary thromboembolism. That is my personal comments. I think there is a lot of question and answer, and then we can discuss it properly. Thank you, Tawfiq, and thank you, Madam, give me the opportunity to be here with you in this wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ghulam Azam. I was muted while I was talking to asking you a question and take the floor. Okay, thank you, Professor Ghulam Azam. My simple question to Professor Fozila ma'am, how can we differentiate chest pain, shortness of breath, especially in emergency settings, from other situations like acute coronary syndrome or bronchial asthma or heart failure, as well as chest pain, shortness of breath?
So thank you for your question, Dr. Mir Nesar. And I think already Professor Ghulam Azam has also pointed out that first of all, we need to take a very quick history, and a history of predisposing factors is very important. Like a patient has had a surgery and now 2 days down the road, he is becoming breathless, short of breath. He is sweating, he's in shock, he's having chest pain. So a predisposing factor, or like Kolim said, long haul flight and now the patient is breathless, or patient with pregnancy gave delivery a couple of days. So, and I think nowadays, for our written exams also, these questions are coming like a clinical scenario, this, and then the patient comes with breathlessness, this, you find, so what will your next diagnosis be, what test? So I think for students, they have to, first of all, know that these are the predisposing factors which can lead to pulmonary embolism. So presence of predisposing factors along with features of breathlessness, chest pain, etc. And as Professor Ghulam Azam said, if we do a rapid ECG, we can differentiate it from acute coronary syndrome. If we just measure, he already said blood pressure on both arms, maybe there is inequality of the pulse or so dissecting aortic aneurysm, we differentiate from that. And an X-ray or even just percussion will give us an idea whether it is a pneumothorax or not. So very rapid history and history finding of any predisposing factors, or if there were other histories of previous episodes like this, and doing some routine tests like doing a ECG and a X-ray will give us some clues of diagnosis, initial diagnosis.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. And is there any special characteristic between chest pain regarding pulmonary embolism and acute coronary syndrome? Is there a special characteristic?
Well, if the pulmonary embolism, it will depend on the site of the embolus. If it is a large embolus and it is centrally placed and like a saddle, then the chest pain will be very much like the acute coronary syndrome. Whereas if it is a small peripheral embolus which has subsequently infarcted, it will have features like pleurisy. So a small peripheral embolus or a moderate side peripheral embolus will have features like pleurisy, but a central will have more features like acute coronary syndrome.
Thank you, madam. And second question, another question to Dr. Kolim. How you can manage a suspected pulmonary embolism in the periphery before sending the patient for tertiary hospital?
Management of acute pulmonary embolism, if patient is, we should assess severity. If there is high risk, if patient is hemodynamically unstable, then we should give thrombolytic therapy. As in our country, alteplase is not available. Thrombolytic therapy can be given if patient is in cardiac arrest or hemodynamically unstable. If patient is intermediate risk patient, intermediate low risk, intermediate risk patient, then we should give IV heparin. It is 80 unit per 80 unit per kg body weight loading dose, or 5,000 unit bolus, followed by 18 unit per kg per hour, or 1,000 unit infusion. And then we should overlap, if we should started oral anticoagulant followed by IV infusion of heparin. And we should overlap 5 days as we discussed that monotherapy with warfarin reduce anticoagulant protein C and H, and so there is thrombogenic risk. We should overlap with heparin, low molecular heparin, or fondaparinux with vitamin K antagonist. And we can give NOAC as it is also recommended by ESC guideline. And low molecular weight heparin can be given 1 milligram per kg body weight 12 hourly, or in America they used 1.5 kg milligram per kg body weight single dose.
Okay, can we use NOAC in case of other than warfarin? Is it recommended?
Yes, it is recommended by FDA. Apixaban, rivaroxaban can be used, but in case of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, there should be only vitamin K antagonist. And in case of pregnancy with breastfeeding and antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, we should give a vitamin K antagonist.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question, please. May I ask?
Yes, definitely, Dr. Ashok.
Regarding the thrombolytics, is alteplase not available in our country? Tenecteplase and streptokinase both are available. Urokinase rarely. So, is there any superiority of tenecteplase over streptokinase? As we know that in acute MI, tenecteplase is a better choice than streptokinase. So, is it true for the pulmonary embolism as well?
But there is no data, there is superiority of thrombolytic therapy regarding the alteplase or streptokinase. But alteplase is given easily, and it is bolus dose, 100 milligram bolus dose, so we can give it easily. But in our country, as alteplase is not available, we should give only streptokinase. And tenecteplase is not recommended for management of pulmonary embolism till now.
May I ask another question, please? Yes. Regarding long-acting anticoagulation after pulmonary embolism with persistent risk factor.
Yes.
So, what are the persistent risk factor? Another is unidentifiable risk factor for deep vein thrombosis.
Persistent risk factors are if autoimmune disease, disease and inflammatory bowel disease. They are persistent other than antiphospholipid antibody syndrome also. But in case of cancer patient, we should give long-acting, lifelong oral anticoagulation, or there is some observation that if patient is cured from malignancy, then we can stop anticoagulant.
Dr. Kolim.
Thank you.
For the prevention of deep vein thrombosis, that is, in other words, that is for prophylactic use of to prevent pulmonary embolism, what anticoagulant is recommended for using, especially either warfarin or NOAC, the novel oral anticoagulant? Which one is preferred, or what's in the guideline latest?
Guidelines is this: if there is we use in case of prophylaxis, we can use low molecular weight heparin or NOAC or vitamin K antagonist. But if we use vitamin K antagonist, then we should overlap with other low molecular weight heparin or non-functional heparin. So it's better low molecular weight heparin.
For the prophylaxis?
Yes, sir.
Long-term prophylaxis. Regarding oral anticoagulant.
Oral anticoagulant in case of warfarin only for antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. NOAC is not recommended only for antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, pregnancy, and with breastfeeding. In all other cases, NOAC can be used according to guidelines.
Say a patient having valvular heart disease with atrial fibrillation. In that case, what?
No, that is not related to pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis.
But it may cause pulmonary embolism as well.
Dr. Kolim, so far I know warfarin still drug of choice till today.
Yes, sir.
But the other drugs, NOACs, are the suitable alternatives of the warfarin. What do you think?
Sir, there was initially no study was regarding NOAC, but nowadays there is many data regarding NOAC, and ESC guideline recommended preferably NOAC if we can use.
So far I know, if facility is there, if you can monitor, so you should institute warfarin. If there is not possible to monitor or chance of any complications to monitor, then you can think alternative drugs like NOAC. Anyway, and one thing, Ashokda, regarding streptokinase and tenecteplase, actually streptokinase is a drug, is non-specific, fibrin non-specific drug. That's why it is preferred. And tenecteplase, it is fibrin specific, that's why it is not preferred in pulmonary thromboembolism.
Okay. Dr. Tanvir Adnan. Are you audible? Dr. Tanvir Adnan? Are you online? I didn't understand your question. Can you?
Sir, he cannot talk if not a panelist. You just ask his question.
Not. So just you can read out the
He will not be able to talk, sir. He is a panelist.
He just asked one question.
You can ask on his behalf, sir.
Okay. But I didn't understand his question. That's the reason.
What is the question? Just you can read out it.
Pulmonary hypertension due to chronic pulmonary, how should we proceed to diagnosis, and what should be the optimum duration of
Sir, I
treatment?
think due to chronic pulmonary embolism, that's what he meant.
Chronic pulmonary embolism.
Yes, because many cases of that we diagnosed as primary pulmonary hypertension, actually if you take the history, some group of patients had history of recurrent pulmonary embolism sign symptoms. So in primary pulmonary embolism, some author recommend long-term warfarin or anticoagulation therapy, possibly because of pulmonary embolism may be the region or etiology of some cases of primary pulmonary hypertension.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am. Should we conclude here, as because already time 1+20
Right,
minutes.
thank you. Right, thank you. So we would like to thank Professor Ghulam Azam for giving us his time and also sharing his knowledge with us. And I think we had a pretty good discussion. And thank you to all the audience. And Mir Nesar, you can conclude the session, I think, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you all panelists and speakers as well. Thank you very much for attending the session, for attending this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Allah Hafiz.
Allah
Allah.
Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.
এখন গোলাম আজম এখন কিন্তু পালমোনারি